Hi and welcome to another Sculptris tutorial. So today we'll be covering opening, saving and exporting in Sculptris, as well as looking at the options, the advanced options in both Sculpt Mode and Paint Mode. So as we are already in Sculpt Mode, upon entering Sculptris, we now will cover the last few buttons. So we've got new sphere or Command N, and that will add another sphere into our scene. So you can select to add another sphere into the current scene or to create a new scene with a new sphere. So import, which is Command Shift E, the shortcut, and you can only import OBJ file 3D models that you've created in other 3D programs, and then you can import them into Sculptris using this import button, but it must be in OBJ file format. The same with exporting. So whatever you create now in Sculptris will be exported as an OBJ file format, and the shortcut is Command E for that. New plane will add a new plane to the scene, or add an object, or create a new scene. And then you've got the options there. Open, so this is to open an existing Sculptris file that you've already worked on previously, and you'll be opening up. That's how you can open and continue on with a file you've already created. And then saving, to save a current Sculptris file, it's Command Shift S, or just hit this save button. It's very straightforward, pretty simple, and the Go Z is the button to transfer between Sculptris and ZBrush if you have ZBrush installed. Otherwise, if you don't have the ZBrush files installed, this will be not an option for you. Okay, so that's saving, importing, exporting, opening and saving in Sculptris. Now the only difference between the Sculpt mode and the Paint mode is the Go Z option. So before we move on to Paint mode, we'll just cover the advanced options by hitting the Options key. Okay, so these are the advanced options under the Sculpt mode. So we currently have remember settings selected. Now this will remember the settings that you have for brushes and so forth. Recover from crashes will cover, will open from the last saved version that Sculptris by default will save for you, just in case your computer is overwhelmed and crashes, and once you reopen it will say open from the last saved version. Okay, so we've got background. Here is where you can import an image, a reference image that you want to sculpt by, which is great if you need something to be extremely accurate. You can sculpt against the background image by importing it, and it has to be in a PNG file. Same with background fog, that has to, fog background, that has to be a PNG file. So here you can select a fog. You can add fog to the scene and select the image that you want the fog to be against, and that will also help with setting the color of and ambience of the fog for that scene to mesh with your actual model. Save image, so here you can also save the image, save a depth map, and there's so that will just save the current scene as the current rendered scene as one image, and the depth map, it will create a 16-bit grayscale map. So that will create a depth map PNG file for you. Save with BG means that you're saving the current scene with the current background image that you have imported. So you can do that if you want. Save with AA, saving with anti-alias. So you can, what that does is it minimizes pixelation in the image and keeps the image crisp and clean and as smooth as possible without the pixelation. So brush spacing. So the sculpting is set on a series of dots. So this brush spacing is the amount of space between these dots. So you can adjust the brush spacing there. You can select fog off and fog and depth of field. So the fog off will determine the strength of the fog. That will determine the depth of field in the image. So that will blur out distant images, and that will the slider will determine the strength of that effect. So this will increase the render time. You could get a similar, just be aware the depth of field will increase your render time, so you could get a similar effect by taking in your depth map and into Photoshop and using the blur filter and in Photoshop to get the same look or a similar look that you're after with the depth of field for that image. So here you can, the size, so we'll go into the size pressure, size strength, and unify tools. Size pressure is where the pressure of the pen pressure controls the brush size, and then the strength pressure is when the pen pressure controls the brush strength, and the pressure sensitivity, and it's how Sculptris responds to the pen pressure. And then we'll go on to pressure sensitivity. Pressure sensitivity is obviously like the tablet, working with the tablet and the touch of your pen and the sensitivity with the pressure of your pen and tablet. And the Unify tools, it will keep all your global settings of your brushes consistent. So if you want a brush to remember a particular size and strength, then you could switch this off and Sculptris will remember the brushes individually, the settings for the brushes individually, whereas the Unify tool settings will unite the same settings across the board for all the brushes. So if you do not want this, then you can disable this function and enable it when you do want it. Compensate sculpting at symmetry line. So what this means is when you're brushing and using symmetry, your brushes will overlap on the symmetry line, and so this is to stop the overlapping so they stay within their own border, essentially. Beautify Relax Mesh option. So what happens when you're sculpting, your Sculptris will automatically relax the mesh and as well as add geometry to the mesh to account for finer detail. So it will smooth out the areas surrounding it as well. So if you don't want this to happen, you can disable that, but it's very good. It's a very good option, very good tool. So it's on by default. smooth divide. So it's saying to turn off to preserve corners. So smooth divide's another great option, but it's saying so if you want to preserve the corners, then to switch this function off. So as you divide, it will keep it smooth across the board. So it will smooth it out. So the reduce strength option down here, the slider, you can this will determine the strength of the reduce button. So how essentially it's aggressive in removing triangles from mesh. So it's set quite high now, which is fine for me. So it depends on what you want to do. So you can adjust that slider to suit your needs. Free camera option is switched off, which is recommended. Free camera will eliminate the constraints of your camera. So currently the camera is set to rotate around the actual object smoothly and pivot around it smoothly. So if you enable it, it can make angles look very weird, and it's why it's off by default. Auto pivot, this revolves around rotation of your mesh, so of your actual model. So auto pivot is a logical pivot point that Sculptris maintains that the camera can aim around as you rotate around your 3D model. So that's definitely recommended to keep that on, so you don't lose sight of your actual object. If you do disable it, it again can make your scene look very weird. You can lose sight of your object altogether. FOV, so this is the field of view. So this adjusts the you can adjust the field of view, and that will adjust the near and far settings. So you can play with that depending on what you require. Turntable Animation will produce a turntable animation for you. It will rotate around your sculpt, and you can save this animation out, so you can get a nice turntable of your finished sculpt. Tablet navigation is where you have further options to use your tablet essentially to navigate predominantly in the actual Sculptris scene. Here is where you can also use the traditional classic Sculptris navigation hotkeys. So by switching on traditional Sculptris navigation, you will activate the old school initial Sculptris setup navigation system, but currently by default Sculptris is set to ZBrush hotkeys, which makes sense when you're traveling between both programs. It keeps things nice and consistent. Show symmetry line, that's to help you see the division between your model, the exact precise division between your model as you're sculpting. So that's a very helpful tool, that's why it's on. Show quick help, this gives you extra information, helpful information on the base of your screen as you go along, to give you more information on shortcuts, etc., and quick tips essentially. So export vertex normals in OBJ, this will give you your normal, this will include your normals, your information of your normals in the OBJ file that you export to then take into another 3D program. So you can switch that on when required. UV deformation mode. This gives more control over the way Sculptris calculates UV mapping when entering paint mode. Any sculpting made influences the UVs. The deformation mode adds weight in portions of the mesh to give more space in the mapping. So essentially you can get greater detail, your UVs will look better when you are working more detailed by having this switched on. Just depending on the level of detail that you require, or of what you actually require, whether you want to switch this on or off. So that's the sculpt options that we've covered, and they're almost identical in the paint mode options, but however we have a few more options that we'll cover in the paint mode options. So now we'll cross over into paint mode, and as explained earlier, you have the option to set the resolution of your texture maps before you begin painting. So if you know what you need or require, you can use this to adjust the pixels that you require. Okay, so if we go over here, you'll see it's exactly the same as Sculpt Mode, except Sculpt Mode had the Go Z option, which you don't have here. So we still have the new sphere option, or Command N, the new plane option, import OBJ file, Command Shift E, or export OBJ file, Command E, open a Sculptris file that you've already begun painting. To do that, you go Command O, or just hit this button, and save is Command Shift S, or just hit the save button to save a current file, that painting file that you're working with. So exactly the same as the sculpting mode, except for the Go Z button is not here, as it only is included in the sculpting section. Okay, so going into options. So as you can see, it has the exact same features in the sculpt mode as is in the paint mode, except for what we have included, what we have new in this mode is surface angle fall off. So what this does is it prevents problems when you're painting your textures, so that the paint when you're painting oblique surfaces, so paint doesn't affect paint surfaces behind it and so forth, or the fading of the painting. So this is for the angle that you're painting, so it doesn't hit or fade onto other parts of the object that are behind the angle that you're painting, the particular angle that you're painting on. So essentially, it prevents paint being painted on hidden geometry behind the geometry that you're aiming for, essentially. So you can switch this on and off. It's on by default. Combine color and bump. This is a fantastic option if you want to combine coloring and bump, and you want to create that at the same time. So if you want to create veins, or if you want to create a bumpy surface and paint it at the same time, this will save time because you're creating the bump and coloring it at the same time instead of having to do them individually. So that's a good time saver. that one, the height from bump map and the height from geometry. So what this does is it's the height mask setting allows a combination of bump painting with geometry adjustments to protect raised and indented surfaces. So when you select bump map, it will ignore the geometry, and when you select geometry, it will ignore the bump map. And then the actual height mask depth slider, you can adjust. It controls the height of the masking effect, and you can adjust that there. So as you can see, all the other options are completely identical from the sculpt mode to the paint mode, except for those new middle options there that are obviously just for painting, the painting mode. And that basically covers everything. So I hope that you have learned something new, and this helps you go further with Sculptris, and hope you enjoy sculpting and painting in Sculptris.